I will continue with the talk that I did at Osher USA a few years ago on events, cultural, political, social, in not just in the US but all over the world. So we'll delve right into part three. Now, we left at this stage where we talked about the well known musical Hair, which staged on Broadway and was highly successful uh, musical involving Vietnam War protests, and some absolutely classic songs as well. Okay, on the space front, US had launched Mariner 5, which was to follow up on 4 and was a replica, and that was launched to assess the Venus atmosphere by radio measurements as well as various element detection and spectra and taking samples from solar particles, magnetic field, etc. So it was a highly scientific mission that was successful and made the trip, and now it's lost and stopped functioning. Okay, and this was again, trying to keep up with the Russians, who were somewhat ahead and had managed a landing uh, on the Venus planet. Okay, on the local front, the protests on Vietnam were in full swings when an 100,000 strong march was held in Washington at the Lincoln Memorial, as you can see from the water and the signs and the protest and the classical sign of the young woman offering flower to the soldiers, and that was part of the 82nd Airborne that was called to guard the Pentagon. And this was not just the East Coast hippies, but also varieties of political figures who were part of it, and some well-known names such as author Norman Mailer, Dwight McDonald, Noam Chomsky, Paul Goodman. So these were, the people who were on the forefront of protest march. And similar protests were held all over the Western world. And obviously, the provocateur at large, Jerry Abby Hoffman, was very much on the scene with the premise to lift Pentagon by psychic energy, believe it or not. And not surprisingly, a fairly substantial number were arrested, including Norman Mailer. And these are some of the images which reflect of the time from the African American soldiers on duty in Vietnam to the marchers who are mostly white and middle class, and the young woman who has an unusual body sign that she's carried. And at that time, the N word was not considered taboo, as you can see from the cover of Time magazine. Okay, and this was not to be outdone. The so-called silent right had held protests in New York City, and this where you can see that the so-called cross-section of Middle America, the veterans of foreign war, and the people who were formerly attired in the style of the 60s. And so these were the people who put Nixon in the White House, and he claimed to be speaking for the so-called silent majority. And so that was so both sides were at odds with each other. On the other front of mission to the moon, Apollo 4 took off the first test flight for the moon from the well-known Complex 39 in 1967 as a preparatory stage for moon landing and to keep the JFK's promise. And the explosion and the rocket power was so loud that the whole building was shaking. It was just a, and so description was given by the famous newscaster Walter Cronkite, who was the anchor for CBS and had a tremendous amount of public trust for several decades. Okay, on the popular front, a publisher named Jan Venner, based out of San Francisco, he was earlier involved in the hippie movement and the human being moment that took place in the early part of 67, the Golden Gate Park. and for the Summer of Love. And following that, he published a sort of newspaper or news weekly called Rolling Stone, which is still very much around and has become part of the American culture. It has had a staying power because so many other well-known magazines have come and gone. And at that time, the Carl Stokes was the first African American mayor of a major city. Cleveland was elected. So the civil rights movement had produced some fruits, and the magazine transferred 10 years later to New York City to be in the heart of publishing empire. And so this was again, this was a title, one of the one from Bob Dylan's record, and and also some of the other classic rock Rolling Stone songs, which were used the title of Rolling magazine. So that has a lot of tie-in with the music industry and American culture. And this was again, there were various good things that were happening. This so-called Great Society promised by Lyndon Johnson was in action and did some very worthwhile things, such as establish the Public Broadcasting Corporation, improving the air quality, pollution, signing the control of the meat production, and age discrimination became a law. So that was so there were a lot of good things that were done by the for general good of the public. And at the same time, the war that had ended, the 6-Day War, with the defeat of the Arabs by the uh, plucky Israelis, and so UN Resolution 242 was passed, calling for withdrawal and armistice. And that still, the idea was solid, but obviously that was not carried out to the full, and it took a few more years, and as part of the negotiations, uh, which were brokered later on, and and at the same time the Palestinian plight continued. So this was part of the Middle East was still in turmoil as usual type of thing. It was so there were in different sides had different arguments. The U.S. and U.K. were on at odds with each other, as you can see from the yellow sign. The Lord Carrington and Arthur Goldberg, they had different interpretation as to what this resolution, which was not respected by all the parties involved. Okay, at the same time, on the cosmology front, at the Jordal Laboratories in UK, Jocelyn Bell, who was the associate of Anthony Hughes, had discovered pulsating stars, which were later on proved to be rhythmic pulsations, and they were new types of rotating neutron stars, which rotated at a very mathematically precise interval of 1.33 seconds. And at that time, obviously, people were thinking, okay, well, this was the aliens which we were waiting for, but this was, alas, that did not turn out to be the case. So this is presents a schematic view of the pulsar. The sphere in the middle represents the neutron stars. The curves indicate the magnetic field lines that protruding curves, and the emission beams, and the green light represents the axis on which the star rotates. So this was a totally new kind of star that was proposed, and as it has happened in this discovery being recognized, Anthony Hughes was awarded the Nobel Prize, but Miss Jocelyn Bell was left out, and it has happened not just once but many times since history of science. Okay, on the medical front, the uh, pioneering surgery was carried out by Dr. Christian Barnard, who was somewhat of a publicity hound, and at the same time was not quite straightforward with the establishment. And when he performed the surgery, he had learned a lot of the earlier steps from the US-based surgeon and did not acknowledge it, and continued to live the glamorous lifestyle. And obviously at that time the results were rather poor because the immune protection was not well worked out. And this was a few days later followed by a surgeon at Maimonides in New York City, and a well-known surgeon named Adrian Kantrowitz, who I had the good fortune to work with when I was at Sinai, Detroit. And this was at the same time a less glamorous surgery was done, which is very much changed the life of heart disease as we know it. This was done by a Dentinian surgeon at the great Cleveland Clinic named Rene Favallaro, and the coronary bypass surgery was done. This was way before the balloon stent came into existence. It was almost 10 or 12 years later. So Christian Bernard was recognized for his pioneering step of heart transplant. And the patient lived relatively for a few days and died of some complications either due to infection or combined with rejection phenomenon. Okay, and a well-known musician named Otis Redding was going for a performance in Wisconsin, and his plane had crashed near Lake Mendota. And I think because of copyright, and I will not play this song, but Sitting on the Dock of the Bay is the well-known song, which a lot of people who grew up in that area will know. Okay, I think I'm going to skip that because it can get banned on uploading to YouTube. And on some of the songs that were popular on billboards, where these are the varieties of song: "I'm a Believer," "Happy Together," "Georgie Girl" by the Beatles, and then "Windy," "Somebody to Love," "Brown Eyed Girl" by Rock and Roll, and "Saying Something Stupid" by Nancy Sinatra, and "So Can't Take My Eyes Off You," okay, and "To Serve with Love," which will go to, and we'll talk about the movie a little later on when we address the movies. So some of these songs have become iconic in the rock and roll era. And on the movie front, these are the movies that made fresh memories. And Dirty Dozen was the Nazi era movies were always popular. The Cool Hand Luke was starring Paul Newman, and Guess Who is Coming to Dinner tackled the racial issues. In Cold Blood was about a murder in Kansas based on Truman Capote's novel, and How to Succeed in Business Without Trying was a comedic satire on the business world of America as it existed at that time. Okay, so these movies were iconic and still jog back memories for those who grew up in that area and are worth watching, at least some of them. Okay, and the movie that was identified the generation was The Graduate, which made superstar of Dustin Hoffman, which was the story involved a young man who was seduced by an older woman. So that was a risque proposition, and the words that were made into American lexicon. I have one word for you, and that no, it does not mean horse-based, okay, but it meant plastic at that time. But and this was satire in later on in Saturday Night Live computer chips. So we can see how the cutting edge technology has changed from plastics to silicon. Okay, and so the movie was accompanied by the classic soundtrack by Simon and Garfunkel and Mrs. Robinson, and some of the other songs are absolutely uh, will not be forgotten for so many generations and still bring back memories for the older generation as well as the younger generation. But again, and some of the books, yes, we should not forget books. And Milan Kundra's book and 100 Years of Solitude, he went on to win the Nobel Prize. Desmond Morris' book about the evolution of human species, Naked Ape, was a bit risque for that time. And again, in the medium is the message that has become the catchphrase for advertising industry. And so these were some of the well-known books which were the product of the time. So, and at the opera, there was an opera called Morning Becomes Electra. It was a reconstruction of the Nazi massacre. Subsequently, became into a movie called Massacre in Rome. It suggested that Pope the 12th did not intervene substantially, and there were some other movies which are worth mentioning called Rosemary's Baby, which was about the uh, sort of magical things and the evil in society type of thing, where eagles dare against Second World War, and The Chosen, Confessions of Nat Turner. So there were some very good movies that were produced at that time. And okay, moving on. And this was what was going on in the economic front. The inflation rate was 2.7%, which was nothing to sneeze at. And this may shock you that the Dow Jones Industrial Average was below 1,000, and now it is somewhere in in 30,000 plus range. Average house cost 14,000. Income was proportionately low at 7,300. Rents were low, and gas petroleum was 33 cents. And this was before the Arab oil embargo. Uh, and the average cost of a new car was 2,700, moving cheap. But some of the manufactured products, due to U.S. labor costs, were not cheap. To put it mildly, the Polaroid camera was $50, and a pen, a prestige pen Parker that was made in Janesville, Wisconsin, was almost $12. And the real cost of war was nothing to sneeze at. You can see that the death toll kept rising. As many as 18,000, 16 to 17,000 people died in 68, from 11,000 in 67, and and at the same time, U.S. deaths were again that numbers are impressive, as you can see from 50s onwards. That the death toll on human life was something to be remembered for as long as we live. And some of the material may be familiar that uses public domain songs and melodies which are poetic lyrics about marijuana, the diggers, the San Francisco neighborhoods, personal experiences, while displaying a banter of a web that with the audience. And the audience participated in the recordings at the same time. And so this was so the Hyde-Ashbury farewell. So this was some of the songs that were done with the San Fran 1967, and obviously some of the other events we've already talked about, type of thing. So okay, and 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 the book that was published by a person named Lenore Kendall was titled Love Book, and again at that time the society was not quite ready for it, and this was the Hyde-Ashbury corner, which was the hippie mecca, so to speak. And we already talked about the international edition of Rolling Stones, equal in US, but there was also from the UK there was a magazine called International Times, which was covered the uh, music and cultural industry at that time. Okay, on the science front, the Hans Bethe, who was at Columbia, and he worked in the Manhattan Project and was one of the giants of quantum physics at that time. He was recognized for his work in cosmology, and the physiology of eyesight and vision was identified with the rhodopsin protein by a guy named George Weld, along with some others. And so there was, and there were some other chemistry prizes, which, for the sake of time, we won't get too much into it. And this was Nobel Prize in Physiology was given to the people who did the physiology of the eye, and along with George Welt, there were other people from other countries. In the rest of the world, United Kingdom bans capital punishment, which is still illegal in the United States. Homosexuality was decriminalized, and the modern hospice movement started. And there were some horrendous viruses which were far away in Africa, but with travel, some of the cases did occur in Germany, as well as in the foot and mouth disease, which is a rather contagious viral disease, was in a small epidemic in the United Kingdom. Maoist insurgency in the communist struggle was continuing in India. Military rule was established in Greece, and oil surge for the North Sea, which made the European countries very rich, especially Norway and United Kingdom. So that was successful. And again, this may not be on copyright because it's the public.
A year to remember, a scene to remember. Sir Francis Chichester was almost home. A welcoming armada went out from Plymouth to greet the hero who had sailed round the world in a small...
And we had already discussed that earlier. For sake of time, I won't get too much into it. And we already talked about the European Union membership that was vetoed by Charles de Gaulle. And so These were some of the English news. On the fashion sense, some of you may or may not remember the skinny woman who was a supermodel of that time named Twiggy, and she popularized the miniskirts and the so-called androgynous look. And in retrospect, one worries if this some of these models did not have anorexia, and so this was and gradually some of the feminist movement, which was Britain was at the forefronts of fashion industry and some of the new trends, and they were gradually very accepted in America as well, type thing. So, and for those of you who are more interested, we'll I can send some notes out. And Britain was this happening place to be.
This, ladies and gentlemen, is London. Swinging London, it's been called, though some people might find a different adjective. Social rebels have taken over in what seems more like an invasion than a revolution, because they've got their own new language that is way out and weird, to say the least.
Okay, so that is the British News Agency, and you can find that online type of thing. So this was, and some of the other movies where the first time the Wimbledon was broadcast in color, and the Beatles were performing "All You Need Is Love" and with guests Mick Jagger, Mariana Faithfull, Keith Richards, Keith Moon, Eric Clapton, Patty Harrison, and Jane Asher, Graham Nash, and so some well-known names which are still very much in a popular music scene. Okay, at the same time, finally, a long ban racial marriage uh, came to Supreme Court for the state of Virginia had on their books. Interracial marriages was prohibited, and so the case actually did make it to Supreme Court, and it was overturned unanimously, and the conviction was given. Uh, Equal right protection was invoked, and and this goes back to several decades. That in 1959, another couple had pled guilty to living as man and wife against the peace and dignity of the Commonwealth of Virginia. They were sentenced to 1 year in prison, which was suspended, that they would leave Virginia and not return for 25 years. But when they did come back, that's when the case went to the Supreme Court later on. Okay, and finally we're coming to the end as to we shouldn't forget the iconic American football game, which was played at the last day of 1967, and in the National Football League conference. It was called the Frozen Tundra. Even the whistles were frozen. Some of the players may have frostbite. They so legendary coaches were involved, and the Green Bay Packers did win. And you can see the temperature was nothing to sneeze at, minus 36 with wind chills. So that brings us to the end of 1967, and we'll continue in the next part.